For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Clemens. I run the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation. And the New America Foundation is a sponsor of this book. If you look on the spine of the book, which I hope you all get, are we sold out yet? I'm sure we will be by the end of the evening. The New America Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution. We've grown in 9 years from just 4 or 5 people to about 130 staff. We're in the policy scene in lots of areas. That's enough about us. And I also want to recognize 2 people here. Daniel Levy, who's going to join me for a little bit of the program in a little bit. Daniel Levy runs our Middle East program, as well as Patrick Doherty, who's my deputy director of the American Strategy Program. The folks that are serving wine are on staff. Be nice to them. And save me a bottle. And let me tell you a little bit about this book and how it began. In January of 2006, we conceived a salon series, and our idea roughly was to try and get people together every once in a while to have serious talks about foreign policy, to bring in voices who maybe people knew, but try and nudge them to say some surprising things, go a little bit deeper, or talk about the nexus that we were in today on the national security and economic fronts that we're in. And what we did in January, our first salon was with Zbigniew Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft. And the rules were, we did a lunch, actually, and we had 35 people join us. We were going to have all of you there, but Brent said no. But he did let us put it on the record. And you may recall that next weekend, every talk show, Tim Russert's show, George Stephanopoulos' show, Maureen Dowd's column, were filled with quotes from Zbigniew Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft. That started our Salon series. And that was in 2006, and it was an important time. Both of these men have had different but important comments about the vector of American foreign policy today. And as we began to think about the next president, not critiquing what all has happened, but looking at how to get back into a disciplined, strategic trajectory that gets America's national security portfolio back into a position of health, that was something I thought, what a great project, and could we get these 2 guys to write a book together? So I called them both up through their emissaries. Eric Melby, where's Eric? Wave, Eric. He's right in the middle. I called Eric. I said, would he do it? And Eric said, no, I don't think so. I'll try. And they both turned me down because they didn't want to write a book together because they don't agree on everything. And that came out. But they do agree on a lot. And then I think it was Zbigniew Brzezinski who said, not a book, but why don't we have a conversation? And that was where David Ignatius came in. David can't be with us tonight. I'm sure he's off helping to comment on the new blockbuster movie that Russell Crowe and Matt Damon are in, Body of Lies. But David couldn't be with us tonight. But he organized a really terrific 8-part or 10-part series of discussions which have been edited into this terrific book. And so I give you America in the World, and we're going to have a short evening now with Zbigniew Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft, and I want to thank you both for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
What I thought I would do to open up this evening is to read just the beginning of a section, to give us some context of the age that we're in today and what we've come through. David Ignatius says, it sounds like there was a fear that any vulnerability anywhere might become a general vulnerability everywhere. This is as big. That was part of the Cold War mentality that we've carried on, perhaps, to our new circumstances. It's big. What did it feel like for you to be in the cockpit? Is there something wrong here? Okay. In the cockpit of advising the president. And Brzezinski's comment was, well, one of my jobs was to coordinate the president's response in the event of a nuclear attack. I assume, Brent, that was your job too, right? I'm not revealing any secrets, but it was something like this. We would have had initial warning of an attack within 1 minute of a large-scale launch by the Soviet Union. Roughly by the 2nd minute, we'd have a pretty good notion of the scale and the likely targets. By the 3rd minute, we would know more or less when to anticipate impact and so forth. Also by the 3rd minute, the president would be alerted that we have this information. Between the 3rd and 7th minutes, the president then decides how to respond. It begins to get complicated immediately. If it's an all-out attack, the response is presumably easier. You just react in total. But suppose it's a more selective attack. There are choices to be made. The president is supposed to weigh the options. How will he react? There's an element of uncertainty here. In any case, the process is to be completed roughly by the 7th minute, by which time I assume this was roughly the same with you guys, right, looking at General Scowcroft. So far, And these two gentlemen advised the 39th, 40th, and 41st presidents of the United States. If you take just that window of time, that's 5% of American history. If you take their collective period of being right at the table of serious national security sculpting during the Cold War period and after, these two gentlemen roughly helped preside over 15% of American history as I look at it, which is a very substantial amount. If I own 15% of Google or any enterprise, you know, it's a substantial time.
AIG?
So, yeah. Is that where you're at? You know, Ed, you wrote about the nuclear knife, and so let me start with you, Zbig. You shared a time, and rather than reflecting just on the nuclear knife that we all lived on, can you comment a little bit about the choices that we have to make today and how we've proceeded? I know the world in those terms may seem safer, but the drama about national security concerns and about American power seems as dramatic today to some degree as it was then, in my view. But what do you think?
It may not be quite as dramatic, in the sense that it certainly isn't potentially as apocalyptic as it was at the time. Because the fact of the matter is that we did live for several decades, once the Soviet Union reached a certain strategic level, in a context in which if something broke down or someone did something potentially irrational, highly aggressive, that we could have an exchange in which the consequences are beyond our capacity to imagine. What you didn't have time to read in this comment that you just read was the observation that once we decide to respond, and assuming it's a large-scale attack, we in Washington are all dead in roughly 28 minutes from the first call that the National Security Advisor would have received. And 6 hours later, about 150 million Americans and Russians or Soviets are dead. I mean, that was the actual reality. And we tried to conduct it, Brent did, we did, in a rational fashion that wouldn't panic the people, wouldn't promote fear, anxiety. We weren't demagogic about it, but we were quite clear in trying to maintain a posture which would, to the extent possible, deter this from happening. Today, the choices are not that apocalyptic, even if we get a horrible terrorist act, which I don't think in the foreseeable future, in the near future, is going to be nuclear. But if we had something like World Trade Center, or even a single nuclear explosion, it certainly wouldn't be anything comparable to that. Entire societies wouldn't perish. Today, we're faced with something much more complicated. I think complexity is the key problem, and complexity which can spiral out of control and thereby create a situation of growing international deterioration, destruction of stability, a variety of consequences, which cumulatively would have, of course, very destructive consequences. So our stewardship of international affairs has to be very sustained, intelligent, prudent, and guided by a sense of historical and strategic responsibility. And to different degrees, perhaps, I think we both feel that that wasn't entirely the case in recent years.
Brent, do you have any comments on that? And I want to add one element to this. Stephen Hadley, both, you know, he was speaking in an off-the-record session that someone leaked the notes of a few years ago, but he says, I only wish I had to basically do my job in Brent Scowcroft's time, because we didn't have the complexity, as much complexity. We now have so many other arenas of national security concern in the contemporary world, and the neatness of the bipolar world is gone, and we're being pinpricked in so many different areas. I wonder how you look at that.
But I think Zbig described it about right. There are two fundamental differences. One is the apocalyptic threat that we faced. A mistake could have cataclysmic consequences. That's not true anymore. But still, that was relatively an orderly world. We knew a lot about the Soviet Union. We knew a lot about their forces. We had studied them, and we knew how they were likely to react to things. And so both sides moved very cautiously during the Cold War. It was a relatively predictable world. Now that threat has gone, but the world is completely unpredictable. We don't have any idea where some of the threats may come from. The fact that the attack on the World Trade Center, for example, was putatively ordered from the deserts of Afghanistan. Unthinkable now. I mean, then. So it's such a diffuse world in that sense. Steve Hadley is right, because we don't even know where some of the problems come from. And there are a myriad of pinpricks, none of them serious, but cumulatively, we could be like Gulliver and the Lilliputians in terms of the problems.
But let me just add one more point to that. Whoever you cited who said that in some ways he wished he was in that previous condition, right? Whoever you were citing.
Stephen Hadley.
Yeah, okay, well,
Yeah,
Steve, all right, well, I don't want to criticize Steve because
Has
I like
your job.
But I,
He has a few percentage
Yeah.
points of American history. He's helping.
all right, I've crossed the threshold, so I'll keep going. I'll say this much. You know, it's very easy to say that for one very simple reason. We survived. We didn't blow it. There wasn't that apocalyptic event. But at no point in the approximately 25 years that that situation lasted were we that sure that it wouldn't happen. And that's the key point. And we knew that if we made a mistake, it would be fatal on a scale unimaginable in human history.
Let me ask you a quick question. We should be talking about the future, not the past, but I just do want to know. You held the job before he got there, and then you vacated, and he got the job back.
Well, no.
I guess there was somebody
there
in
were 8
between.
years
That's right.
in
There was
between.
8 years in between. So you didn't like play with the typewriter, or remove the W off the here. But I think the question is, did you find when you inherited the position and what was left by Brent, and you came into the National Security Advisor position, were there fundamental continuities in the way in which you both looked at the world, or did you think there were discontinuities then? And I guess to look towards the future, given your sage experience, do you feel as if this is a pivot point in American history today? Do you feel as if we're sitting on a point of major historical discontinuity where institutions and many of the ways in which we do things have to be rethought?
Yeah, I think it's quite different. First of all, Zbigniew and I knew each other before. I think we met in 1953 or something. So
Did you like each other?
Yeah, we were. We were
managed.
colleagues. But yes, so I would say
We like each
we
other more
didn't
now.
discuss. we had a crisp turnover, but no, we had similar worldviews, and that's not unusual at that time because there was a lot of continuity in the basic structure of where we're going, and that is absent now because there's no foundation to it because the world has fundamentally. I think historical discontinuity is a good description of what we faced since the end of the Cold War.
I agree.
Russia seems to be back. Russia seems, I think that in my view, and I don't share the analysis that many have done, that Russia made an unprovoked invasion of Georgia. But I do feel that beyond the incident of Georgia and South Ossetia, that to some degree, Russia's in a position with the United States where it had a lot to gain by demonstrating an ability to break the middle finger of the United States regionally, but that it also has a lot to gain in showing that the optics of global power haven't changed that much because it doesn't want the responsibility for doing everything else, nor do I think China does. But I'd like you both to talk a little bit about China and Russia and the fact that a global equilibrium seems to be thrown out of balance today. And what would you do if you were advising the next president in terms of dealing with two other, one real ascending power and one provocative power, that both seem to matter more in various other kinds of disputes? So a little bit about on China and Russia, Brent?
I think they're very different countries and very different positions. I think China is in the process that really began in 1972 with Nixon's visit of emerging from the status of really hermit kingdom to participate in the world. And it's done that very gradually, very slowly. And even now, the Chinese are somewhat reluctant to behave, in Bob Zellick's term, as responsible stakeholders. That is, because of their power and their strength and position in the world, play a role in problems that aren't directly related to their own narrow interests. But they're getting better. They've changed dramatically on North Korea. Even on Darfur now, they're admitting that there are problems that they ought to help with. In addition, China is not, my judgment, is not trying to overturn the world order. They're dependent heavily on imports, especially of energy, but of other kinds of raw materials. And they depend heavily on exports for their manufactured goods. That means they have a stake in the system. So they're trying to profit by the system rather than overturn it. And I think that's fairly fundamental. The Russians, on the other hand, have gone from a position of the Cold War of for all practical purposes for our discussion, one of two superpowers, to a position by 1998 of cataclysmic collapse, both politically and economically. And I think that has introduced a lot of sense of humiliation, and the West during that time behaved in a way that many in Russia, including the former president, have taken to be a deliberate attempt to take advantage of the fact that they were weak. So this is a country that for a decade or more has built up a sense of grievance. And now they feel they've regained their strength, mostly as a result of oil prices and so on. But now they're strong, and they want to change that. They want to make up for the past, and they want to show that they are a key player in the world, and it can't be pushed around.
Is it inaccurate to think of Vladimir Putin as sort of a Russian Ronald Reagan, very wrapped up in a national greatness campaign, and it's national greatness as opposed to the kinds of things that they're trying to do? Would that help people on this side understand a little bit more what's going on with Russia?
I wouldn't want to put those two together.
Yeah, you can lead them to water. Zbig, I know you have some thoughts on Russia.
Well, let me first start with China, where I basically agree with Brent. And I would add that beyond the points he made, that what strikes me about the Chinese is the essential patience and caution with which they proceed. And they have a sense of historical evolution, which is based on optimism and with some degree of justification. They don't act as if they were in a rush. I think they have a sense that they are clearly a rising power, and that their rise is facilitated by the existing nature of the international system, so that it's not in their interest to overthrow it, but to work within it while expanding the scope of their influence, the reach of their power, as well as their own well-being. This doesn't mean that they agree with us on everything. In fact, they disagree on a number of issues, but it means that they work within the system. Rather different from, let's say, Imperial Germany prior to 1914, which was challenging the existing system and eventually came into collision directly, particularly with the British, who were the dominant force in that system, but the Russians and the French as well. So I see considerable possibilities for continued American-Chinese cooperation, and in fact for its progressive widening. Brent alluded to the constructive role that the Chinese played in dealing with the North Koreans, and they indeed have done so. And I think in many respects they were as decisive a factor in the progress that has been made, it hasn't been consummated yet, as we, or perhaps even more so. Because they were the only ones who could credibly say to the Koreans, there will be consequences if you don't play ball. We couldn't quite say that unless the Chinese were willing to say it, given the geopolitics of the North Korean context. They may be able to play that role, and I think they're beginning to play that role quietly vis-a-vis Iran. Again, saying to us, be patient, be intelligent about it, but we can at the same time help to move this process in a desirable direction. I think the situation with Russia is rather different, and I think that some of the points that Brent made about Russia I agree with, but on other issues I go in a somewhat different direction. And here, incidentally, let me say that we have a kind of an agreement among ourselves on how we proceed when we disagree. When we
You mean the two of you?
Yeah. When we disagree, we don't try to knock each other's arguments down. What we do is more or less we make the kind of a case that each of us would be making either together or alone if meeting with the president, for example. And if the president says to Brent, you know, what to do about Russia, he would say what he was saying. He would say more than that. And I would say some of the same things, but also some other things which perhaps are different. And the differences are, in my view, as far as I'm concerned, that I put more emphasis on, first of all, the unfinished business of Russian history. And I think it's not so much a question of humiliation, in my judgment. It's a question of non-digestion of certain historical changes. Specifically, the imperial end of Russia. Russia is no longer an empire. It's going to be very difficult to recreate an empire, but there is an imperial nostalgia. You even see it in the wording that Medvedev uses when he talks about Russia's privileged position vis-a-vis its neighbors. There is an imperial nostalgia which comes from the fact that the end of empire wasn't as clear-cut and as abrupt, and in some respects as painful as it was, first of all, for Germany and Japan, but secondly, more ambiguously, for Britain, France, and others. So there's that unassimilated historical experience which still has to be digested. Secondly, there is an unwillingness to come to terms with the legacy of Stalinism. The Germans have disowned Nazism in a genuinely serious fashion. Germany is truly a democracy and truly ashamed of what happened. The Russians are much more ambivalent. Putin, in fact, is proud of the Stalinist experience. And he says that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, a century in which you had World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, and the Gulag. No, the greatest calamity was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's that unfinished legacy. And thirdly, there is a burst of Russian nationalism, which kind of reinforces the imperial nostalgia. And I think our task is not to rekindle the Cold War, not to think of a big collision with Russia, because I don't think it's in the cards nor necessary. But it is to create a geopolitical context in which it will become increasingly clear to the Russians that their only constructive future, the only option that they can really entertain seriously, is to move towards the West, to move towards the EU, eventually towards us. And that means foreclosing imperial options. And this is where the difficult choices arise, for example, regarding Georgia or Ukraine, or earlier the Baltic republics. And I am of the view that if we can create a context that's clear and stable, and the upheaval of which, upsetting of which, would cost the Russians too much, that is, on the whole, better.
Do you think the EU and NATO had an open door for that sort of
Well, there was certainly a hell of a lot of people who didn't enjoy being part of the Soviet Empire and wanted to be secure and free and wanted to be in NATO. And to disregard that would mean that instead of having problems today regarding Georgia or tomorrow regarding Ukraine, we probably would be having problems today regarding Estonia or Latvia or whatever else in Central Europe. So I think this is the way we ought to move, and that in turn means I will have to face some very difficult choices, and we haven't gotten into that specifically, but that is, do we help Georgia, and if so, how much? Do we do something about NATO, and if so, in what fashion, et cetera, et cetera?
You know, I often quote Zbigniew Brzezinski in something he said once. He said, you know, it may be self-inflicted, but the defining challenges for the United States in this era are in the Middle East. That how things turn out in the Middle East will be a measure for the rest of the world, how they perceive us. And so I want to invite my colleague, who's the director of our Middle East Policy Initiative, Daniel Levy, to pose two questions to our colleagues here. And oh, you've got a mic.
I brought one.
So Daniel is British. Israeli. Yes.
Not that people will discover that when I start talking. I'd like to turn to you first, Speak. Early hours of Thursday morning, a new leader is elected to Israel's governing party, Kadima, Tzipi Livni, currently foreign minister. She expresses a commitment to the two-state solution. Last Sunday, it was the anniversary, the 15th anniversary of the Oslo signing and the White House Southern Lawn. Is that going to be enough, do you think, that there is a new leader there to carry it over the finishing line? If not, what would be needed? And as a second question to you, why does it matter? Both of you in the book talk about this being a priority. There's only 12 million Israelis and Palestinians in that region, in the territories and in Israel combined. Secretary Rice has been there more than 20 times, more than the number of visits to Africa, India, China combined. Why do you place it as such a high priority? Coming from me, that might be a leading question.
Well, regarding the potential Prime Minister, Livni, as we all know, she's a woman. She's going to be inheriting the shoes of Golda Meir. Till now, female leaders who have emerged on a scene historically dominated by men have tended to act as very assertive men, whether it's Mrs. Gandhi or Mrs. Thatcher or Mrs. Meyer. I sort of have the sense that Mrs. Livni, or MS Livni, has the self-confidence not to try to emulate that as a political objective, that she has a sense that something is fundamentally wrong with the trajectory, historical trajectory in which Israel finds itself. That the moment for a solution that's constructive and based on reconciliation is approaching its end, if it's not exploited. That the prospects after that are increasingly grim, either an apartheid state dominating 5 million Palestinians or more in the foreseeable future, with horrible consequences for Israel, or a region that becomes increasingly destabilized and from which we are progressively pushed out, which is horrible for Israel as well. So I hopefully entertain the view that she will actually try to be a new type of political leader who creates the preconditions for Israel's long-term security and peace. But for her to be able to do that, and I'll stop on that, and perhaps Brent can talk about the importance of the peace process in the region if he wishes. I don't think she can do it on her own. She has to be helped. And she can only be helped by the United States. If the United States is not prepared to step forward, and instead of just talking vaguely about its devotion to peace and then saying, oh, the problem is up to the Israelis and the Palestinians to negotiate, and here is a roadmap to nowhere, but please follow it. That's not going to work. It hasn't worked. I think at the very minimum, we have to be willing to make it clear to the Israelis and the Palestinians that we and the international community, and in fact the majority of Israelis and Palestinians share already a vision of what the fundamentals of that peace arrangement ought to be. 4 points essentially. I've been saying this for years, and for this I've been attacked by a lot of people who think that the way to prove sympathy and devotion and friendship to Israel is to be warlike and aggressive. 1, no right of return for the Palestinians, a very bitter pill for the Palestinians. 2, the genuine sharing of Jerusalem, without which there would be no stable peace. The peace will not be viewed as legitimate by the Palestinians and the Arabs. A very bitter pill for the Israelis, genuine sharing. 367 lines with equitable exchanges of territory to make it possible, and demilitarization of the Palestinian state with US or NATO forces on its territory to give Israelis security in depth. We ought to be willing to say, this is our position, this is what the international community demands. Your relations with us, to the Prime Minister, but also to the Palestinian chairman, will be affected positively or adversely by the degree to which you're prepared to move in that direction, and we mean now.
Brent?
Yes, with respect to the importance of the peace process in the region, I think that one of the results, in part, of the incursion into Iraq is that the many problems of the region have become consolidated and interlocking. And the two great problems that we face are Iraq and Iran. Can, I think, be helped measurably by the peace process. First of all, we need to engage around Iraq with the neighbors, with the Arab world to help us After the first Gulf War, we got a lot of help from the Arab world. We're getting almost none now because what we've done has alienated much of the Arab world. Pursuing the peace process would change that dynamic to a certain extent. It also would put Iran on the defensive. It would steal some of the thunder from Hezbollah and Hamas, whose raison d'etre, it's not their only goal, but the Palestinian issue is the one that they use to demonstrate the injustice that's being perpetrated on the region. So I think it is very important psychologically to turn the attitudes of the region around and help us in working through the Iraqi and the Iranian issues.
I want to pick you up on one thing you mentioned there, which is Hamas. You mentioned in the book that in the 70s you couldn't have contact with Fatah.
Yes,
Directly, terrorist organization. And the go-between was the Moroccans.
that's right.
What many people today, and it happened at a dinner the other night with members of Congress, said, but how can we have a deal with the Hamas reality? Are we handling Hamas correctly? Should we be doing things the same, differently?
I think we should be talking to Hamas. I see absolutely no justification just because we don't like people to refuse to talk to them. Because one of the ways you understand points of view and one of the ways you can seek to resolve issues is by talking. That talking is not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of supplication. It's a sign of trying to understand what the issues are and seek for a way to resolve them. So certainly I would talk to Hamas. I'm not sure at this particular point it would be very fruitful. But my sense is if there were progress being made on the peace process, that it would be followed very quickly by an alteration in Hamas's view, who would not be left out of that peace process and left with a successful peace process and Gaza outside it, which would be an untenable position for Hamas.
Let me just build on it. You both have talked to both presidential candidates' teams, and you have announced who you're supporting. Brent Scowcroft has not, but you're talking to both. Are there, with Daniel's point that he just made, are there people lurking in the frameworks of both candidates who would share your views but who may not be vocal about them? Because we know that neither president endorses the views you just both shared. So, but that's politics, not policy. But on the policy side, do you think that there are sensible calculators of interest in the McCain camp and in the Obama camp who can step where you and so many? I mean, I'd like to say that Brent Scowcroft at the time of the Annapolis summit joined in a letter with Ted Sorensen, Carla Hills, Paul Volcker, Tom Pickering, Eric Shinseki. Zbigniew Brzezinski happened to sign that letter as well. And so it was a pantheon of leaders, but nonetheless, neither candidate has been able to say the words you just said.
Well, I think the camps of both candidates are wide enough you can find probably about everything you want in either one. I think that there are wide views about Hamas, and sincere people take different views. The administration has one particular view. I happen to think that we gain almost nothing. In the worst days of the Cold War, when everything Soviet was anathema to us, we had serious discussions on arms control, the most sensitive issue for both of us. Now, did they resolve the problem? No. But as a result, we understood each other a lot better. You could sense what they thought their advantages were, disadvantages, and it gave a greater sense, at least to me, that we could proceed not with blindfolds on, but with some notion of where the red spots and where the green spots were in the Soviet attitudes.
I would simply add by asking you, Steve, what makes you think that candidates for high office should be saying what they think? There's a difference between
is why I
being
love
a candidate or a
Brzezinski.
president.
See, he's a lot cleverer than I am.
I respect that. I want to open up to the floor as best we can and get some questions here. I do want to, before I do that, ask, why did you two do this book, other than the phone calls that came in? I mean, what do you really want people to take away from this book? Why did you do it at this point? Brent, you were particularly focused on having it come out now.
Well, I think the way Zbig described our differences is what we want to inject into the national debate, so that these are difficult, complex problems. None of us know the answers for sure, but if you can put forward points of view and discuss them rationally and present them to a president as serious views, not as impassioned, emotional things, then we will have a reasonable discourse. And we both have thought that our discourse in recent years has not been that way. It has been increasingly strident and increasingly partisan. And so that's why I went into it, and I think that's we've been able to preserve that well.
I think Brent said it very well. I personally felt much the way he did, and I would simply add that it seemed to me that in a situation of complexity, but also fear and demagogy, there is a tendency for a society and its elite to become polarized. And if we're to have an intelligent foreign policy in that kind of historical setting, if we can have, one, a reasoned dialogue between us, and if we can thereby contribute to some turn again towards bipartisanship in the shaping of foreign policy, we'll have made a small contribution to our national well-being. And I knew where Brent stood on issues. I knew where I stood on issues. I knew that we agreed on some, disagreed on some, but that there was a fundamental consensus and also a style of making a case that, if taken seriously by others, and especially by the next president, might actually help in fashioning a reasonable, strategically meaningful, historically relevant foreign policy for the United States. And I happen to think that we're at a stage in which, if we don't do that, the price is going to be prohibitive.
Norma Birnbaum.
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Brzezinski.
I'll repeat it and just make it short.
I'll make it very short.
Yeah.
You spoke of the unfinished business confronting the Russian elite and indeed the Russian people. That is to say, the liquidation of their imperial legacy. What unfinished business do you think confronts the United States?
What unfinished business confronts the United States in the same sense that you said unfinished business? So I suppose that what Norm is saying is, does America have empire issues?
Well, I think I understood his question.
I'm just repeating it for the folks online.
Well, I think you have, in a way, by redefining it, answered it. I think the question is, how do we define a meaningful role for the United States in the 21st century, taking into account the very significant changes that have taken place in the course of the emergence of this new century. I think the differences between now and what characterized the previous century are becoming increasingly self-evident, and the priorities are much more interwoven, not only geopolitical, but social, global, and that requires a different strategy.
In the very back.
Why, I'd like to ask either one, wonderful description of Russia. Why was anybody in this wonderful town surprised on the eve of the Olympics when what happened happened? We've got a Georgian who went to Harvard, advised by a lobbyist who works for one of the candidates for President of the United States of America, and you have a KGB colonel who acts like a KGB colonel.
Got it.
Why are we surprised?
So the question is, why were we surprised by the Russian interaction with Georgia, given President Saakashvili's education here, proximity, closeness to many neoconservatives, etc.?
Well, I was surprised at the timing, and in a way I was surprised because I'm not sure this is fundamentally in the Russian self-interest. They have a good deal to fear from separatism, and to encourage it in Georgia seems to me a dangerous game. But in one way, strategically, one need not have been surprised because the Russians followed with anguish our course of dealing with Yugoslavia and Kosovo. And time after time they said, don't do that. And in later years said, don't do that, it's just like South Ossetia. And we said, don't be silly. Kosovo's unique, it is not. And so I think whatever you think about their methods, and I think they were unusually Russian, they thought the only way they could convince us that they were serious is to do something about which there was no mistake.
Right in the very corner over here, I can't see who you are, but I'm...
Kathy,
Yes, Kathy.
I have a question regarding the Middle East peace process. If you were to engage with Syria, how would you do it, and what would you hope to get from the outcome?
Good question. The question is, if you were to advise on the Middle East peace process, what would you advise on Syria? How would you do it?
Well, speaking for myself, I would certainly favor the process that seems to be hesitantly underway with the Turkish kind of patronage for it, namely bilateral talks between the Israelis and the Syrians. The basic formula for a settlement, I think, is also known, namely Syrian-Israeli accommodation on the territorial issue, that is to say, return to the status ante 1967, in return for which, de facto, the Syrians would disengage from the relationship with the Iranians, which then in turn would have implications for the ability of Hezbollah to pose the kind of a challenge that it has, and presumably leaving Lebanon with territorial integrity and some form of quasi-neutrality.
Do you think the Syrians want a deal?
I was in Syria early this year, and I had a meeting with the President Assad, and I asked him point blank whether he would be prepared to sign an agreement with the Israelis, which would be more or less like what Sadat signed with the Israelis, which is a territorial political accommodation, focus on the bilateral issues, disregarding all other issues, notably, in both cases, the Palestinians. And I mentioned specifically disregarding the Palestinian issue. And Assad categorically said yes. I then went to Israel after that, and the Israelis were a little more cautious in their reaction. They said, yes, that would be very nice, but we would like then the Syrians very explicitly to terminate their relationship with the Iranians, to change their position on Hezbollah, on Hamas, and so forth. I don't think the two positions are incompatible, although probably the former arrangement can be formal. The latter one, if it emerges, will emerge by stages and be less formal.
General, would Syria be a priority?
I think it's a priority from the standpoint of the region, as I was talking about. I cannot believe that Syria wants to be totally dependent on Iran. And I think giving Syria some more options is in our interest and in their interest. I would make it a priority, but in the past, the Israelis have been very uncomfortable trying to deal with both issues, the Palestinian and the Syrian issue simultaneously. I don't have the sense that that is a problem for them right now. My sense is that they're ahead of us in dealing with the Syrians. But that would be my only
It
hesitation.
does seem to me, though, that if you were able to move forward with Syria, as Big suggests, that you could, to some degree, kneecap Iranian interests. And then to bring it back into our hemisphere, I see a lot of similarities with Cuba and Venezuela. That if you were able to open some doors, not all doors perhaps, but at least start a process that might be different than we are today with Cuba. This is one of the issues that Zbig talked about in his book Second Chance, in which he gave your former boss an A-, gave Bill Clinton a C, and failed the incumbent president in terms of their foreign policy management. But nonetheless, on Cuba, again, you would be, I think, limiting Venezuela's interests in promulgating its own interest in the region. Is that inaccurate? Is that?
But wait, Steve. Let's not talk about Venezuela, Cuba, and Syria in the same sort of context. There is one complication with the sort of Israeli-Syrian accommodation. I don't speak for Brent, but I suspect that's what he might have had in mind partially. In any case, I have a hesitation here. Namely, it could be, I'm not saying it is, but it could be also a very deliberate effort by the Israelis to divert the main focus from the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue.
Well,
Because if they can
well,
get
yeah.
the Syrians to accommodate and the Palestinian issue is left standing, untouched, they may be able then to say, well, what's the problem? So, you know, there's no threat of war anymore, so let's leave the situation of the Palestinians as it is. And I personally don't think it can be. I think it would be terrible in the end, not only from a moral point of view for the Palestinians, but it would be terrible from a geopolitical point of view for the Israelis.
That quite well could be. I think in the past the Israelis have also wondered about the ability of their domestic situation to handle both at once in terms of how much the population would take.
I'm hoping Kami is going to ask a Pakistan question.
Yeah, sure.
If you can't, if you're not, then you don't. Yeah, okay.
It's a tough problem.
Yeah.
Some people believe in this town that one of the reasons we are unable to defeat Taliban because they are being helped by Pakistani ISI under table. And knowingly that we run our foreign policy not on moral grounds but on political and economic reasons, and we have big interest with India, we don't have any interest with Pakistan. It's almost failed state. How can we resolve this Taliban or Afghanistan issue without resolving Kashmir issue?
Great. So for those online, the question is about, I'm not going to go into the depth, but Pakistan, Kashmir,
Right.
Taliban. What would you do about this tough neighborhood?
It's a really tough neighborhood. And Pakistan is a very complicated situation and has become more so rather than less so in recent times. The problem, I don't think there's any doubt that there's cross-border traffic between Afghanistan and Pakistan. That has been a lawless region for centuries, actually. One of the problems that Pakistan faces sincerely is that their army, the raison d'etre to the army ever since independence has been to face India and to prepare for a battle with India. Now they're being asked to turn around, face the other direction in a very different kind of warfare that they've never trained to, and against their own citizens. That's a very difficult situation for the Pakistanis, and I think you can see in the back and forth. We've got our own interests, our own priorities, I think basically Pakistan government and the military want to cooperate, but there are great impediments to do so.
I'll just add this. I'm increasingly concerned that we are sliding into a posture in Afghanistan where we had to go in, and I fully supported our going in. But I also felt that we should go in, destroy the Al-Qaeda, overthrow the Taliban, and leave. I am increasingly afraid that we're beginning to repeat the same mistakes the Soviets made. That we're beginning to be involved in increasingly spreading conflict, first with the Afghan society, and then potentially by extension, which is already underway, with Pakistan. First in terms of the border, then at some point a collision with some elements of the Pakistani army, then more generally with a country of 170 million people. And instead of having a problem with Afghanistan with its 25 million people, we'll have a problem with about 200 million people who are tough, warlike, and they don't like foreigners with guns in their countries. So I am of the view that while we have to maintain our military presence, and we certainly have to insist that our allies stay with us, because this isn't just our problem, it's also Europe's problem in a variety of ways, that we ought to be thinking more about partial, progressive, fragmented kind of accommodation with different Taliban elements in Afghanistan. Taliban may be an obnoxious orientation, a very brutal notion of how to run a country, medieval in its values, but the Taliban was not engaged in waging a war against the United States. It was a very specific Afghan phenomenon. And I would like to see that possibility explored more actively, because otherwise I'm really very, very concerned that we're going to sink into a spreading conflict in which more and more Afghans will be against us, and certainly from the very start, most Pakistanis against us, if it begins to involve the borderlines penetrations, attacks, and
Shooting
stuff like
against
that.
our soldiers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Can we resolve this without?
Yeah, Kami, I'm
touching
sorry.
Kashmir?
Kami, we've got 200 people here, and I appreciate your effort to be like that guy on the White House floor, but not going to happen tonight. Roey Rutenberg, go ahead.
I was wondering if both of you gentlemen spoke about China earlier and its growing role. I was wondering if you could address what you expect the next president's relationship with China should be vis-a-vis the current issues, the trade deficit of $250 billion, possible military threat from China. If you could maybe relate some of your own experiences and advice to what you would give the next president, and if you think either or both of the candidates are surrounded by the right advisors.
China's
not to deal with
rise.
China.
China's rise. And we have a member of the U.S.-China Security Review Commission right here taking notes.
Well, why don't I go first on this
Yes.
one? Very briefly, $250 billion deficit. You know, is that the fault of the Chinese, or is that our fault? First of all, you know, I think we have to ask the basic question: are our sort of economic problems with the Chinese entirely doing with the Chinese, or is it something about us that's involved here? And the fact of the matter is, if we're going to live in a globalized world and an interdependent world, everybody has to make adjustments and accommodations. And if we want to compete, we obviously have to compete with novelty, technology, innovation, education, and so forth. And I don't think we've been paying enough attention to that. It's a little bit like our current problem on the financial scale. You know, how did we get into this mess? What is it about the values of our society, our definition of the good life, our view of our role in the world that is involved here? For example, waging a war by borrowing from, among others, the Chinese a lot. You say the Chinese are building up their armed forces. Well, yes, of course they are. But it just so happens that in a world of 192 countries, one country spends more than all of the others combined. You know, how much more do we need to spend to be secure? At what point in this new globalized world of interdependence, some kind of reasonable balance can be struck? I think these are the kind of things the next president will have to think about in dealing with the Chinese. This doesn't mean accommodating on their terms, but recognizing that in an interdependent world, the patterns of accommodation require adjustments and even sacrifices on both sides.
General, you have some China history.
I agree with that. I think one of the most interesting parts about aspects of U.S.-China relations is that it has been, since 1972, been relatively consistent. And every president, starting with Nixon, and some of them have come into office with some very, very different ideas about the relationship. They've all ended up in fundamentally the same place, that it's in the U.S. national interest to broaden and deepen our relationship with China. I have no reason to think that that will be any different, and I certainly agree with Zbig. One of the interesting things about the economic relationship, yes, where there's a huge trade deficit, but China is one of the principal purchasers of U.S. treasuries. They had $460 billion in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So this is not them profiting from us. This is a relationship which is deeply intertwined.
So they're sinking too.
It's a world economy.
Do you think, I mean, I want to go to Jeremy over here, who's been very patient. I recognize he's not in the room, but I'm trying to be nice to some folks before we close up here. But do you, when you look at China's rise is to some degree viewed because of its massive economic growth, lifting so many hundreds of millions out of poverty, and the promise. It's sort of like the Google stock, if you will. I can tell everybody I own Xerox stock and I own Google stock. Xerox is a big company that's gone nowhere. And its stock, I think last time I checked, is $12 a share, and it was $12 a share about 10 years ago. Google, of course, which doesn't have all the same assets, nonetheless is sky high. So it's the promise of what it is to be that establishes what people think about the market weight, if you will, of Chinese power down the road. How do you think the world looks at the United States? Are we the Xerox or are we the Google? I'm sorry to any Xerox folks here, but I mean, in the sense, does our economic decline turn into a diminishment of power and diminishment of options?
No, I don't think the world looks at at the United States as being in economic decline. I think they think we have been foolish, but not that it's that fundamental that our economy is in permanent decline. I don't think that at all.
Well, I agree, and besides, they know damn well that
You own Xerox stock?
if we're in decline, so are they.
Yeah, okay, good.
That's
Last
a-
question, Jeremy.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm happy to tell you I can also accommodate Daniel's issue.
Oh, I didn't hear what Daniel's issue
The
was.
question I would like to ask, which we'll get at Daniel's issue as well, is does the NPT matter, and does our recent accommodation of India in any way impact meaningfully how we will approach both Iranian and North Korean nuclear ambitions?
Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and Iran. Was that what Daniel was trying to
Iran.
scribble to me? Iran.
It was Iran.
Yeah,
It's
Iran.
NPT, India,
Iran.
North
Iran.
Well, I'm basically opposed to that treaty. Maybe the intentions were good.
The Indian Treaty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe the intentions were good, but I think it certainly further undermines the credibility of our position regarding non-proliferation in general. We have been heavily involved, actually, in helping to proliferate to several countries.
Is it a harder case to make with Iran if you do the U.S.-India deal?
Well, to some extent, it's a harder case in general to make. We have helped the British, we have helped the French, we have winked at the Israelis. We haven't helped either the Indians nor the Pakistanis, but we've sort of accommodated ourselves to it. And now we're going to be helping the Indians with the possibility that a significant segment of their nuclear establishment is going to be free of inspections and free to expand as rapidly as possible. And that's the war-making part of that establishment. What will be the implications of that, first of all, on the Pakistanis and their sense of what they ought to have? But the one that worries me even more is its impact on China. China, over 40 years since its acquisition of the ability to produce nuclear weapons, has practiced minimum nuclear deterrence. We have thousands of weapons directed at China. You know how many Chinese weapons are directed at us? It's somewhat sensitive, but the generally acknowledged range is between 18 and 24, with none of them able to cover all of the United States.
That's a general range.
Yeah, that's a general range. That's right. 18 to 24.
Is it closer to 18 or closer to 20?
Yeah, maybe in between. Now, if the Indians begin to develop 50 nuclear weapons a year more, which they now will be able to do, how long can the Chinese maintain that posture? And then what are the implications of that? So I think in general, I feel uncomfortable about this agreement.
Now, I don't know, actually I don't remember if it's in the book because I read the unedited book and then the edited book, but about Iran in particular, I want to ask General Scowcroft. You made a comment there, so I won't hold you to it, where when you think about Ahmadinejad, you didn't look at him as sort of the top tier force in Iranian decision making. In fact, you said not only was there a higher level and higher person, but several orders of higher level decision making. And I would like you to both talk as we conclude about Iran, the Iran challenge, how to think about Iran, and maybe educate those people watching tonight and those people here with us about how we need to kind of, I don't know, to some degree I think President Bush's dominance as a global presidential leader has made us sort of presidentialize every other leader out there without thinking about the complexities of the political environment which they are. But could you reflect on Iran a little bit and how you'd approach it?
Yes, and I think that follows on the NPT, non-proliferation problem. I agree with Zbig that insofar as non-proliferation is concerned, that agreement with the Indians makes it more difficult for us. With Iran, I think one of the principal problems with Iran is the nuclear aspect. And to me, it is more important with respect to proliferation in general than it is whether or not Iran itself has a nuclear weapon. Because I think we're on the cusp, maybe, of a new growth in proliferation. And if Iran is allowed to enrich uranium, whether or not it ends up making a weapon, I think that will be followed in sort of self-defensive way by others, like the Egyptians, like the Saudis, like the Turks, and who knows else. And that will bring a whole scale of countries
So it could
months
become
away
Japan. It
from
could
a
become
nuclear
Japan and not have a nuclear weapon, and all the bad stuff will still happen.
weapon. Yes, yes, I think so. And I think that's why it is very important that we deal seriously with the Iranian problem, that we try to get Russian cooperation, Chinese cooperation, we pretty well have European cooperation, to try to deter that. And why don't I stop there? If you want me to go into the Ahmadinejad, Khamenei.
How about you come over another day?
Thanks.
Dr. Brzezinski?
Well, I would simply add, almost as a footnote to what Brent was saying, that if we're serious about dealing with this problem, we have to be, first of all, serious about negotiating. And I don't think our posture really is a serious negotiating posture, because we are demanding that the Iranians stop enriching, which is the issue, as a precondition for negotiating with them. So the point we're making is, you give up what is essential for you, and in return for that, we'll be willing to negotiate with you about what? So it's just not a tenable position. We should be either willing to say to the Iranians, let's negotiate seriously, we don't want you to enrich. For the duration of the negotiations, you stop enriching, but we'll simultaneously lift a lot of the sanctions we have adopted against you. There'll be a quid pro quo. And we could always stop the negotiations after, let's say, 8 months or 9 months if we felt they weren't moving forward. Or we could say to them, let's negotiate without preconditions. That is to say, you keep on enriching, we'll keep on applying the sanctions, and then we'll see in a few months whether we're getting anywhere. But we're not doing either. So right now, we're really not negotiating seriously. I hope that the next president, whoever he is, will make a serious effort, because the risks have been outlined, in my judgment, very correctly by Brent. Now, if we can't negotiate, would I go to war? I will say no, because I am still convinced that by and large deterrence does work, even though it's difficult and it's testy and it's risky. But deterrence has worked with others. There's no evidence that the Iranians are suicidal or maniacal, that they're just going to commit suicide the moment they get their first bomb. It just doesn't make any sense. And we do know that if we go to war with Iran, the consequences are inherently unpredictable, but very devastating. So it's not a very good choice to make. So yes, I would continue negotiating. And whether Iran can change over time or not, it's hard to predict. But I would note the fact that the Iranians are becoming increasingly more like the Turks. That is to say, the level of education is comparable. The role of women is far greater than we tend to assume. There is a real gap between the society and the mullahs that rule it. If we keep pressing them and threatening them, we actually create a political union between the dominant sort of intelligently politically engaged masses and the regime. And I don't think that's in our interest.
I agree.
You know, when the New America Foundation launched its American Strategy Program, the general assumptions that it brought to what it was trying to do were similar to some degree in what Dwight Eisenhower tried to do when he inherited the presidency after Harry Truman. And what was classified for a long time, and you used it as a teaching exercise, was a fascinating exercise he did with his national security leadership, with the generals, the intelligence officers, his command staff, and walked them through what was called a solarium exercise. This was conceived in the solarium of the White House. And over 5 weeks, he and his staff divided into several teams. Some teams wanted to blow up the world tomorrow. Other teams wanted to wait. I mean, we had rollback, we had a massive retaliation, and we had a modified version of containment. And containment had been Harry Truman's mantra at that time. But the Republicans, when they came in, hated it. They hated George Kennan, who was part of the process but sort of fired. They hated containment. And Eisenhower used this exercise to put serious strategic choices in front of his command team and say, let's have a competition over worldviews. And by the way, you need to look systematically at the social, economic, and political consequences of these and own them over time. And to some degree, in my view, I didn't think that same sort of disciplined thinking was happening in Washington. So our guiding light has been not necessarily that we know all the answers, but certainly there's a process that can be embraced where many different contending players can come in. So to some degree, what these two great voices in American foreign policy who've been so dominant over such a I call it the nuclear knife, over a great percentage of consequential American history, have helped us, give us something that I think is a very, very valuable chapter in understanding a solarium-type approach to thinking about options and process. And I also want to commend Zbigniew Brzezinski, because many of you may not have read it. Another fantastic book to think in a disciplined way about leadership and choices is Second Chance, which looks at the question of what can the next president do. And both of these books are not just critiques of who did what to whom, who got what grade, as you said last time, but how do you organize for the future. So I really want to give a very, very warm thanks to Brent Scowcroft and Zbigniew Brzezinski for what they did.
Very good stuff.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank all